So what I was saying is that my research sits between media philosophy, digital media studies, and memory studies. And I'm really interested in things to do with ontology, phenomenology, and logics of media. And there's two strands of my research that I'm going to touch on today in the conversation, which are kind of active projects that I'm looking at. And the first one is the potential of the digital for Holocaust memory. So in this sense, what is digitalness, and is it being used by Holocaust memory projects? And then what happens to commemorations when they go online, and how can we archive this? And this is something that Tobias touched on very briefly, that we're trying to develop a project together at the moment. So the first part of this then is linked to questions of what does it mean to be essentially digital? And do Holocaust memory projects, or to what extent do Holocaust memory projects engage in digitalness? I like these funny little words. They always make philosophy slightly more manageable. And historically, a lot of Holocaust memory projects have been very much stuck in broadcast or literary logic, particularly broadcast logics. And it's certainly not just Holocaust institutions that do this. It's very typical of the way many organizations often engage in digital technology. I mean, even Zoom is very much broadcast and telecoms in many ways, adding a video to telephone conversations. And as Immersion said, anyone that knows me will hear me whinge about the words virtual, interactive, immersive, and participatory regularly. They come up in nearly every project that's advertising a new Holocaust digital thing or a new digital project anywhere. And a lot of these terms were pushed by magazines like Wired, which are coming from the industry, trying to suggest the industry is new and innovative, and that and selling it as the new thing. And because they sold it as the new thing, it became the new thing. And a lot of these words were used to create that discourse. And one of the things that often gets repeated about VR and 3D technology is the idea of really being there. And I was just rewatching earlier a video by some of the creators behind, the design team behind The Last Goodbye, the VR visit to Majdanek with a survivor. And one of them says, it was like really being in the concentration camp, like really being in the gas chambers. And it just reminded me of a lot of those questions of authenticity that come up in previous representations in, but also seemed a fundamental misunderstanding of what the idea of virtual actually means. So one of the things I like to do is following media archaeologists, media historians, is try and tap into where some of these words come from, or where else they exist in other discourse. And virtuality is one that's very well known to many of us that work in memory studies. You can trace it in terms of its relationship to memory back to Henry Bergson in the late 19th century. And Deleuze picks this up, and there's a whole field in philosophy of Deleuzians, and effect theory comes out of a lot of that. And for most of these people, the virtual is the opposite to the actual. So in many ways, it's the opposite of being really there. It's very much not really being in the concentration camps. And when people use this idea of really being there or transporting there, it really takes the media as invisible rather than essential to the experience. Now, immersion, as I said, is another one of these words that's my bugbearers. And Holocaust museums have often creative, immersive walkthrough spaces without media technology. And I'm just going to share my screen to show some examples of this. So here we go. These are, there we go. These are immersive spaces. There's no VR headset. There's no photogrammetry. These are walk-through spaces in museums. There's the National Holocaust Centre in the UK, Polin, Yad Vashem, and some of the exhibitions from within the Schindler's factory in Krakow. And Amos Hadaro's written a fantastic book about exhibiting atrocity. And in that, she talks about immersion as fundamental to the very idea of the Memorial Museum. So what defines 20th century memorial museums from 19th century, the traditional early forms of museums, was the very fact that they're immersive and that the technology isn't needed to necessarily do that. And the other one I mentioned, the last one, was about interaction and participation. These are interactive technologies, as if we never engage with each other. before we had digital. We didn't have telegrams, we didn't have telephones. And I think I don't know if this is going to mirror in the screen, but there's a fantastic book called The History of Participatory Media from 1750 to 2000. And it's quite an important book in media history and traces this idea of participation through media far further back than we like to think about it. And a lot of media historians and media archaeologists remind us that the broadcast age was actually kind of a bit of an anomaly. That we tend to think that the digital came out of television and radio, but actually the digital and the way we engaged with the digital talks to some of the media relationships we had before TV and radio. These are slightly different to things that were happening before and after. And Alison Griffiths has written a wonderful book about the kind of history of spectatorship, going all the way back to cathedrals. And in that, again, she kind of reminds us that immersion and interaction are modes that were very typical in 19th century practices of memorials, museums, and other forms of entertainment and engagement. So, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen there. So my kind of next question then with that is, well, if these things aren't specific to the digital, what is? And the three things at the moment that are coming out of my work, and this is very preliminary work, I'm just starting to write some papers on this, are the idea of hyperconnectivity. And in terms of this is thinking about not just the way we are connected with each other as people, but the digital experience is about entanglement with machines. Machines talking to other machines. Codes and algorithms and protocols, humans talking to machines. When we say we put a video up instantaneously, there's a whole load of stuff happening in a computer between networks, or what Wolfgang Ernst talks about as microtemporalities that are just kind of beyond our perception as humans, but they're still happening. And it's really important to think about, that it's not just humans and humans, it's humans with humans, humans with other humans the next day, different machines, different networks. And it's a kind of mess of connectivity, much beyond the forms of connectivity we've been used to before. The next one is that digital experience is always a negotiation between those computational logics of things like discontinuity, discreteness, quantifiability, and intelligibility, and the human, affective, embodied, mushy stuff that we call life, the flow of experience. It's never one or the other. We don't have to worry that by engaging with computers, so by a testimony, for example, will just become quantified data and it will lose the human aspect. That we need to think about the relationship between the two. And we need to think about the way that thinking about testimony in these computational ways might enhance our own understanding with it as well. So this, again, is a kind of complicated mesh. And the other one is about, I suppose, the temporality of memory, and that it's generative, dynamic, and on the fly. And these are words from people like Wolfgang Ernst and Andrew Hoskins. And that very much is opposed to the idea of the institutional collective idea of memory that became quite traditional to think about previously. And Andrew Hoskins has gone so far to talk about that in the digital we have the memory of the multitude. The collective memory is dead. That's quite it's almost like a Dickensian sense of what the end of an era, and the digital has completely radicalized everything. Now, of course, our experience of the way institutions use the digital is often to go back on that kind of idea of collective memory, the idea of being a guardian memory, a safeguarding memory. And I think Imogen's work around the Auschwitz Museum speaks to some of those, that use. But my question is not how do we use it now necessarily, but what is the potential? Are we really tapping into the full potential of what the digital can do for memory? So that's my kind of bigger project. Like Tobias, I saw amidst all the kind of chaos of trying to teach and manage everything else during COVID, this fascinating way that museums and organizations moved online with commemorations, and it was amazing to see, and it raised two really interesting questions for me. The first one is, if commemoration is about lots of people coming together physically, in a specific geographic place to perform particular rituals in sync with each other? Is that what happens when these things go online? Does the digital offer a potential for some kind of new post-commemoration kind of form of doing collaborative remembering in some way? I mean, that seems like there's a really interesting idea there, that is commemoration the only way of doing these kind of remembering events? I'm trying not to use the word commemoration. And then with that, I thought, what we've never been able to do? We've never been able to archive commemorations. You can't archive lived experience, really. You can film the speakers, but you don't get all the other stuff that's going on around it. And I noticed that a lot of institutions, and we would do the same with this event, recorded the event and then put the video online. But when you're engaging in it live, there was a Twitter feed, and you could jump between different platforms, and you could follow tweets, follow hashtags, have other conversations at the side if you're in something like Zoom, for example. And that stuff gets lost when we broadcast it. We save it as a video online and broadcast it out. So one of the projects I'm currently trying to get some funding for, I'm going to work with some of the very cool techie informatics people at Sussex, and Immersion, and Tobias, hopefully as well, is to think about how we can create an archive of digital commemorations, but then also problematize that idea that an archive, at least theoretically, has been considered, a place of top-down power relations, as static, as fixing memory. Of course, in reality, we all know archive practice is much more dynamic than that. But Wolfgang Ernst talks about digital archives as being dyna archives, as spaces of layers and derivative production, and on the fly and ongoing and developing. So we're thinking about scraping data from different digital platforms. How can we capture the sentiment of the tweets that were shared around that event? What happens when we follow a hashtag? What other hashtags are associated with that hashtag? And a lot of events had the kind of official hashtag, but lots of people attach it to lots of other stuff as well. So that's the kind of emerging project. It started off as a bit of an idea a few weeks ago, and it's becoming growing into a bigger and bigger project. So I hope that if we get funding for that, then we can think about and start creating a kind of dynamic, ongoing archive of commemorations.